Hey folks, today we're going to be tackling this one question, which is how does a CEO successfully exit the business? So this is for you if you are a CEO who is considered a hired gun. A hired gun is a person who doesn't own the business. So you are not the majority shareholder, you don't have a significant ownership in the business, but perhaps you do have a small amount of shares, but that's because of the compensation package that you have as a CEO. So you are not the business owner, but the business owner has, or maybe the board of directors or shareholders have hired you to run the business on their behalf. It's important because when you spend 5 or 10 years in a business, or 15 or 20, perhaps even 30 years or more running a business, it's important to have this carefully planned out because that's a big chunk of your life that you've spent trying to build this business, and you want to make sure that you leave on good terms. That's the biggest question that we get when it comes to this particular element is how do you actually leave and make sure that the organization is taken care of, but you as a CEO are taken care of as well? Because if either party, whether that's you or the organization, doesn't end up with proper terms or in a good situation, there's going to be some, I don't want to say bad blood, but there's going to be some challenges on both sides here. So let's take a look. The one thing, I think the biggest thing to tackle here is that for the vast majority of CEOs, they take a look at the organizational piece. That's what they're concerned about. And so it's who's going to take over. How do you determine who is the right fit? How do you train them appropriately? Perhaps you have to bring them in from the outside. What is the right timing? How are you going to communicate this to your team? What is the impact to the organization and the client base and maybe your strategic partners? But more importantly, the biggest thing that I think is missed for CEOs is this element right here, which is you. And I think it really starts with you, because if you have this planned out and a strategy for yourself first, everything else becomes a lot easier and a lot more rational. What we find is that when CEOs don't have a proper plan for themselves and haven't addressed the you element, then it's a lot harder to talk about the organization. It's a lot harder to think clearly and make rational decisions about the organization. And a lot of the times, what we find is because there isn't a clear plan here, sometimes this strategy isn't done properly, or maybe the timing isn't done effectively. You might delay having this conversation about succession. You might delay this conversation or strategy about how do you exit the business. So you push it off as far as you can because you yourself don't know exactly what you're going to do in the next chapter of your life. So that's the first part that I recommend CEOs take a look at, which is obviously you want to take a look at your wealth portfolio, because depending on what your next stage is, if you're looking to take over another organization, or you're ready to retire, or maybe you're going to go out on your own, which is very common as well, you want to make sure that you're financially responsible, that you have the security, but you also have that nest egg or that financial wealth that you're taking a look at, because that's going to enable you to think more clearly. If you're able to take a look at your wealth portfolio and say, hey, look, regardless of what happens in the next chapter, I'm going to be okay financially, and I'm going to be able to take care of my family or myself or my spouse or whoever it might be, then it's going to be a lot easier to take these elements into consideration when it comes to the organization. So you got to take a look at your wealth portfolio. Have a financial plan. That's the biggest thing. That's one of the first questions we ask is, do you have a proper financial plan? And if you don't, get that in place, because now we can talk, we can put the money aside and actually have the proper conversation about what you really want to do in the next chapter of your life. So the next part is, okay, so what do you want to do in the next chapter? You have to excuse my chicken scratch here. But what do you want to do in the next chapter? Do you want to take over another organization? Do you want to start your own business? Do you want to work with a startup? There's a lot of different options there. So you got to know your options or explore your options thoroughly when it comes to the strategy. So that's a second element, is what do you want to do in the next chapter of your life? And have that very clear. And perhaps you have a number of different options and you might not have narrowed it down to one or two, maybe there's 3 to 5, but that's the first place to start. What are the top 3 to 5 options that you have? And what's most viable for you? And this comes back to this family conversation, because let's just assume that you are not single. And let's just assume that you have a partner in life and perhaps even children, depending on your age. Maybe these children aren't completely dependent on you, but they still require you to be a part of their life. What does your family have to say? What does your family want? Because when we interview not only CEOs, but their families, there's a difference of opinions. For CEOs, they feel like, they still want to work hard, they still want to do bigger things in life. And for the family, they want mom or dad home more, right? More often, or they want them more available. Depending again on the ages of your children. If they're older, they may say, hey, it doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter how much time mom or dad has with us now because we have our own families, but you still have to have that conversation, especially with your spouse, because it really comes down to personal goals. Right? The next chapter and the conversation with your family then leads to the personal goals. If you can establish your personal goals for the next chapter of your life, now you're set. Now you've talked about your financial security, your wealth portfolio. You're not too worried about that. You've talked about the options that you've had. You've written those down, your top 3 to 5 options. You've had those conversations with your family. And now you're really nailing down what these personal goals are. And some of these personal goals can be traveling, for example, or maybe you want to put together a charity, or maybe you do want to tackle another big organization, or perhaps it's a startup. As I mentioned before, that's very common. We see a lot of CEOs go into the startup realm after running successful businesses and larger corporations. Now you can start tackling this organizational conversation because there's this element of timing. And timing is very important because it has to be the right timing for you and it has to be the right timing for the organization. If it's right timing for the organization but not the right timing for you, you can stumble. It can be a challenge for you. And if it's the right timing for you but not the right timing for the organization, it may impact the business continuity as well. So let's get into this part of organization. What do you have to address? What are the key elements that you need to take a look at when it comes to your succession plan? Who is going to take over? What does that look like? First thing is timing. Like I said, take a look at timing here and how does it match, right? How does your personal plans, how does it match the organizational plans? Because if you're thinking of getting out of the business in next 2 to 3 years, but the board of directors wants you to stay for another 5 to 6, and maybe there's some restrictions there because you have some clauses in your contract, or maybe your bonus or your share compensation has a timing clause or is connected to your performance over a certain period of time. That's the first thing you got to figure out, is some kind of timing alignment. Then it's a conversation about, okay, strategy. And here's the interesting part. If we're talking about who is going to be your successor, because that's a big question, right? Who is going to take over the organization? Whoever's going to take over the organization has to execute on the strategy that's already developed, or perhaps you're asking or you want the successor to create the new strategy to take the organization forward, because one of the other factors here organizationally is value. What I see with many CEOs is that they get tired if they feel like they're not bringing any additional value to the organization, or they feel like they don't have the skills to take the organization to another level, and therefore, again, they don't bring the value. So, value is very important for you, but it's also very important for the person that's coming on board, because they ultimately, the whole point of bringing on a successor is that they bring value to the organization. And a lot of the times, the value is connected to executing on the strategy. And that's fundamentally it. You need a person in this role who can execute on the strategy. And if you don't have the strategy, or you need to evolve the strategy, and you're bringing on a person to do that, they have to be the right person who can put that strategy together. So I don't want to go down this path of, whole leadership. You got to bring on someone who can take on and be a good leader, inspire people. We all know that. I think that's a given. You can't bring on someone who is going to disturb the existing culture to such a degree that it's detrimental. Obviously, new cultures are created when new CEOs come on board, but you're going to make sure that it's the right leader. So we're not going to get into leader characteristics or traits or stuff like that. I think that's very important for you to take a look at, because that's going to be part of the process in terms of identifying who the right person is, right? You're going to take a look at their skills, you're going to take a look at their leadership traits, you're going to take a look at their character traits, which is another one. But more importantly, can this person execute on the strategy? And Here's the other big thing here, and this is getting a little bit messy here, but bear with me, is the board of directors. And so if you take a look at the role of a CEO, the role of a CEO is not only to take the organization forward, but the role of the CEO is also to manage the board of directors. If you talk to any CEOs and you know this, their two biggest challenges in the business for the vast majority of CEOs is A, the executive team or the organizational team, the people within the organization, and B, it's a board of directors. And how do they connect the board of directors to the organization? And how do they buffer the organization from the board of directors? Because a lot of board of directors, or um, you can say the board itself, are demanding and they want the organization to perform and they want to see results, especially if it's a publicly traded company. They are responsible to the shareholders to show a growth trend year over year, quarter over quarter. And so they're going to demand that. And it's important to be able to manage that relationship effectively. So as a CEO, can the new person not only execute the strategy, but manage the board effectively? And I think that's even a bigger challenge because a lot of CEOs burn out, leave the organization, aren't able to execute because they can't. And I'm not necessarily faulting the CEOs. It's not the CEO's challenge most of the time. It's a lot of times there's a dysfunctional board of directors. And a lot of the board of directors sometimes need a slap on the wrist to say, hey, look, you guys got to get your act together here because you're driving away good talent. So is this new person going to be resilient enough to deal with a board of directors? That's another key factor there for you to take a look at. And then obviously there's a cultural element. This culture is important. And culture isn't just within the organization, it's strategic partners and the client base as well. So culture, yes, we try to protect it internally within the organization by doing things like having a team playbook, talking about vision and values, training people on culture. But culture extends. It extends out to your client base. It extends out to your strategic partners. And that ties into your strategy. Bringing in a new CEO means that there's new relationships that have to be developed. And those relationships are not only internally, but they're also with your client base and they're with your strategic partners. That could be suppliers, distributors, vendors, so many different levels of partnerships that you have. And maybe it's even outside of your industry as well. And so, can this person functionally be a representative of the culture? That's the other element that you got to take a look at. So this is a high level, you can say, plan or elements to take a look at when it comes to your CEO strategy. What are the key things that you have to consider? What do you need to do? And what's most important? And these are the most important things, as I said, and how and when to actually tackle each one of them. The first one is you. That's the first element. You got to take care of yourself. Most importantly, I think a lot of CEOs, again, underestimate this part, and perhaps they feel like they're doing a service by not thinking about themselves. And then there's other CEOs that are just way too caught up on this and they're completely overwhelmed and they don't tackle this thing at all. They just don't know how or what they're going to do in the next chapter of their life. But either way, you got to start with you. You got to take care of yourself. You got to make sure that your finances are aligned, your family is aligned. You know what you're going to do in your next chapter. Maybe write not down to the exact science, but you have options and then you have a personal goal. Then you take a look at the organization because you're clear, you have a clear mind and clear emotions, and then you can get into the organization and say, okay, what's the timing? What's the right timing for the organization? What's the right timing for you? You got to take a look at the strategy, whether you need a new strategy or perhaps you want someone to execute on the existing strategy and continue on with that. And then can this person ultimately be a representative that can deal with the board of directors and keep that culture as well and bring value to the organization? Ultimately, this is what it comes down to is the successor and the whole purpose of succession is to bring value, not only to the organization, but also to yourself. And so that's what I want you to think about. What is the value that you're creating for yourself as you exit? And what is the value that you're creating for the organization? If you do those two things, you're going to be able to exit your organization effectively and leave the business on a proper trajectory to be successful going forward without you.